How do we create a democracy without corrupted representatives that is also not exhausting or impractical like direct democracy? One compromise between representative and direct democracy is to use randomly selected but nationally representative parliaments. These parliaments might have to be larger, although not necessarily, than our current elected parliaments to achieve genuine demographic and substantive representation of the population. But it's important to note that they only need to have a fraction of the total population to be truly representative of the population. This means that most people can just get on with their regular lives, do their jobs, spend time with family, pursue their hobbies and leisure activities, but every now and then you might be selected to become a parliamentarian. It would be like jury service, but the number of people would need to be much larger. This is because the parliament would decide laws, and we want to make sure that there's a representative set of voices that consider all the different perspectives and consequences before changing the law. Okay, let's talk about how we will select citizens. We must use a truly random sample of citizens to create a genuinely representative body. To figure out the number of people we would need for a citizens' parliament sample, we need to know three things. To figure out the number of people we need for a citizens' parliament, we need to know first the national population size, and we then have to agree on a confidence level and a margin of error. These are two terms that come from survey research. We can use these proven statistical survey methods to draw nationally representative samples. We generally know the national population size because most developed countries maintain a list of all their citizens and they conduct a census every now and then. This list needs to include every single citizen, including people who are homeless, those who are living off the grid, the elderly, new voters, even incarcerated citizens, and newly naturalized immigrants. It needs to be a complete list of everyone in the country. So that's the first thing. The confidence level is the probability that our sampled parliament represents the whole population. The higher the chosen confidence level, the more certain or confident we can be about the result. The margin of error lets us choose how accurately our results will represent the whole population. The lower the margin of error, the more accurately our citizens' parliament will reflect the population. So we want a high confidence level and a low margin of error. Using these three pieces of information, we can decide on the size of the parliament that we want. There's no set answer here, and it all comes down to how representative you want your parliament to be. The size of the required parliament depends upon how certain we want to be about the resulting votes and how accurately we want them to represent the population. The greater the desired certainty and accuracy, the larger the needed size of the citizen parliament. We're going to need to balance between what is practical and what is desired. But one thing is certain: this approach will produce parliaments that are consistently and substantively more representative than the elected parliaments we have now. So this will be a big improvement. To achieve genuinely representative parliaments, it's very important that when someone is selected, that they are required to serve. It's very important that anyone selected cannot easily get out of becoming a temporary citizen parliamentarian. Otherwise, we will introduce systematic bias and the parliament would become unrepresentative. For example, poorer citizens may not be able to take time off work, and we have to pay for them to be off work and pass laws to make sure that employers allow them to take off work and provide their salary while they are a parliamentarian. It is essential that laws require all employers maintain the employment and pay the wages of their employees while citizens perform their civic duties. Most countries currently do this for jury service. Employers cannot be allowed to threaten to fire their employees, reduce their hours, remove any benefits, or give any negative consequences for employees that perform their civic duties. Being selected for parliament service will not happen often. Employees will have plenty of time to make alternative arrangements. Their employees will not be gone long. So it is not a big burden and it will not happen often. But there must be enforced consequences to discourage any employers from trying to manipulate or coerce their employees from taking part in citizen parliament. There must be severe punishments for both the employer and any supervisor or manager that tries to dissuade their employees from serving. Anyone who's not employed must receive a fair compensation for their time. So people that might be caring for dependents or running their own businesses must receive enough money to hire someone to perform their duties while they are away. People without jobs must receive a basic salary while taking part as being selected for service in a parliament. The only permissible reason for people to not serve must be medical, or that doing so poses a danger to themselves or others. To make it very difficult for people to get out of serving, which is what we want to do to have truly representative parliaments, we could require that 3 separate doctors must assess and vouch for any medical justification to get out of service. The same could be true for psychological conditions, where we want 3 psychologists to vouch for that person's condition. Now, this of course assumes that the medical system has been fixed to make medical visits free of charge, and that's part of another whole set of problems that we'll discuss in other videos. The core idea is that it must be very difficult for people to get out of serving their parliamentary duties, because otherwise our parliaments will not be representative and our random samples will have systematic bias if people can get out too easily. What might come as a surprise to many people is that this method of random selection will actually produce parliaments that are more representative than our current elected parliaments are. Random selection produces highly representative parliaments, and the number of people that we will need depends on the confidence level and the margin of error, which we talked about earlier. The size of the population matters less, given that the size of most countries is well beyond the threshold that starts to make a difference. Once the population is above a few 100,000, which is most countries, it makes a very minor difference. For example, if we used a confidence level of 95% and a 5% margin of error, the Citizens' Parliament would need to be about 380 people if the population was 30,000 people, but only 385 people if the population was 300 million. The important thing for representing the population is that the selection be as random as possible without any kind of systematic bias. This is why it was so important, why I really emphasized that you can't get out of service and that you need a complete list of every single citizen, because otherwise you don't have a true random sample. That's why we must maintain a complete list of all citizens, and anyone selected must be required to serve, and it must be very hard for them to get out of their service. We're not asking too much of people because all their expenses would be paid, and they wouldn't have to work while they're serving, and they wouldn't be gone for too long. In fact, I'd like to make a future video about designing what might be called a parliamentary village where this would happen. But right now, these videos are talking about the idea in general rather than the physical infrastructure that must be necessary to build that parliamentary space. Moving on. We will have to balance accurate representation with practical sample sizes. The smaller the parliament size, the less representative it will be of the wider population. So let's look at some examples using a hypothetical country of 9 million people. In our first example, let's use a 90% confidence level and a 10% margin of error. In this case, we would need 68 citizens. What this would mean is we could then assume they would be within 10% of the population's preferences about 90% of the time. It is noteworthy that even a random selection of this number of people would achieve a better representation of the population than many currently elected parliaments. Let's use a second example where we increase the confidence level to 95% and decrease the margin of error to 5%. In this case, we would need a parliament of 385 citizens. This would be more representative than the first example, and decisions would be within 5% of population preferences about 95% of the time. This outcome would actually be more representative than almost all currently elected parliaments around the world. Let's push things further and use a third example where we increase the confidence level to 99% and we use a 3% margin of error. In this case, we would need a parliament of 1,842 citizens. This is quite large, but it is still manageable. But what this would mean is that we'd be confident that the decisions of this body would be within 3% of what the population wanted 99% of the time. This outcome would be more representative of the population than any elected parliament has probably ever been. Randomly selecting citizens to make laws on the population's behalf can produce really good outcomes that are very aligned with what the population actually wants. To further increase everyone's trust and belief in such a system, we could have higher legislative voting thresholds. What I mean here is that we could increase the voting threshold that would be needed to pass a law when using these kinds of randomly selected citizen parliaments. This would ensure that results truly reflect the population. We could then be more confident in the outcomes of these randomly selected bodies. It would also provide more legitimacy to the political system as a whole. The appropriate voting threshold to pass legislation will again depend on the population size, confidence level, and margin of error. We could use the following formula to calculate this voting threshold to pass legislation. The pass threshold, which is the percentage of randomly selected parliamentarians that would be needed to pass a law, would be 100% minus the confidence interval percentage, plus the margin of error, plus 51%. In our current parliaments, most votes require 51% to pass laws. This actually produces results that are not representative of the population. It's just the rule we came up with. Using this formula and relying on the previous assumptions about truly random selection, we could be almost guaranteed that any law passed by such a parliament would definitely be what the majority of citizens wanted. We can apply this formula to decide on the voting pass thresholds for the three earlier examples. So let's look at those examples again. Using the same three examples we used before, we can apply this formula to decide what the pass thresholds might be under those three different scenarios. So we're going to calculate the percentage of selected parliamentarians that need to vote yes to pass legislation in those three scenarios. First, using a 90% confidence interval and a 10% margin of error, the pass threshold would be 71%. That means that 49 out of the 68 selected members of parliament would have to vote yes to pass legislation. But it's a high percentage, reflecting the fact that it's a small number of people representing the whole population. In the second example, which used a 95% confidence interval and a 5% margin of error, we would need 61% of the 385 person parliament to vote yes. So that's 235 people out of the 385 would have to vote yes to pass legislation. So it's still higher than 51%, but this also reflects the fact that it's a random selection of the population, and keep in mind, we are already much more representative in that body than we are in most elected parliament. In the third example, which used a 99% confidence interval and a 3% margin of error, the pass threshold would be 55%, which isn't all that different than 51% that we use now. The big difference would be our selected body of citizens would already be much more representative of the population than an elected body, even if the elected body was as many people. The 55% means that 1,014 of our 1,842 person parliament in that example would have to vote yes to pass legislation. Using these three pass thresholds for the three different scenarios will ensure that any new laws they pass are in line with what the majority of the population want.